Welcome to our channel, where exciting and inspiring stories come to life. Here, you will find stories of overcoming, surprising twists and lessons that touch the heart. We believe in the power of stories to transform perspectives. If you like good stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you never miss our releases. And of course, share your opinions in the comments. We want to hear from you and how we can continue to bring you even more exciting stories.
The sun was setting behind the hills of Greenfield, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns of the country club. The sound of clinking glasses and quiet conversations filled the air, punctuated occasionally by bursts of polite laughter. This was where the wealthiest residents of the town gathered: lawyers, entrepreneurs, and old money families who built Greenfield's legacy. Jack Montgomery, 28 years old with an easy smile and eyes the color of cold steel, moved between the guests with practiced charm. Jack had grown up far from the world of privilege. His early life in a working-class neighborhood had been defined by scraped knees, secondhand shoes, and the constant, nagging sense that he was meant for more. He was ambitious, clever, and handsome in a way that made people either envy or desire him. And he knew how to wield that power. The club's events had become his hunting ground. As a bartender turned dash, social liaison at Greenfield's most exclusive venue, Jack had learned to read the subtle language of wealth. A raised eyebrow, a perfectly timed smirk, the slight pause in conversation that suggested intrigue. But tonight, his focus was entirely on Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor was 76 years old, striking with her silver hair, styled immaculately, and sharp blue eyes that sparkled with a mix of wisdom and mischief. She was the widow of Richard Whitmore, the industrialist who had once owned half of the state's textile mills. The fortune left in her hands was whispered about in hushed tones, its vastness more mythical than factual. Jack had begun his pursuit subtly. A compliment here, an attentive ear there. He discovered that Eleanor liked classical music, particularly Rachmaninoff, and tailored his evening playlist to feature her favorites whenever she was present. He found excuses to speak with her during events, asking her opinion on art, which he pretended to appreciate, and recounting amusing stories from his fabricated upbringing. Eleanor seemed to enjoy the attention, the twinkle in her eyes growing brighter whenever Jack was near. As the summer moved into fall, Jack sensed it was time to make a move. He needed to secure Eleanor's interest in a way that was more than polite banter. He planned meticulously, rehearsing his approach and ensuring his appearance was perfect. A navy suit tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders and lean frame, cufflinks that suggested affluence without boasting, and a subtle cologne that hinted at mystery. The evening of the charity gala arrived. The grand ballroom was adorned with gold-trimmed chandeliers and arrangements of fresh orchids imported from exotic places. Eleanor was seated at a prime table near the front, surrounded by familiar faces, but visibly less engaged than usual. Jack's heart quickened as he approached. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I say you outshine every decoration in this room tonight?" Jack's voice was warm, confident. Eleanor's lips curled into a half-smile. "Flattery, Mr. Montgomery? I thought you were more original." Jack chuckled, as if genuinely amused. "Caught me, but even you must admit, some things bear repeating." She raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. "And what brings you over here, young man? Surely not just to heap praise upon an old widow." "Not just that," Jack replied, leaning in conspiratorially. "I was wondering if you might do me the honor of a dance later, to show the rest of us how it's done." The challenge in her eyes flickered, just for a moment. "Careful what you wish for, Jack. I'm counting on it," he whispered, the weight of his words lingering between them before he moved on, leaving her intrigued. The evening passed with an air of anticipation. Jack remained at the periphery of Eleanor's vision, engaging with others, yet always aware of her presence. When the moment came, and he extended his hand for that promised dance, she accepted with an expression that spoke of hidden depths. They moved with surprising fluidity across the dance floor, Eleanor leading as much as Jack, setting the pace with unexpected strength. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned to watch the unlikely pair. Jack could feel the curiosity and skepticism aimed at him, but he met it with a confidence born of necessity. He leaned closer during a spin. "You still have the whole room at your command, Eleanor. And you," she whispered back, "have the ambition of a man who wants more than just a dance." Jack's breath caught, and for the first time, he felt a chill down his spine. There was something in her tone, in the glint of those eyes, that hinted she knew more than she let on. But he smiled, playing the part to perfection. "It's true. I hope I can earn more of your time." They parted at the end of the song, applause rippling through the room. Eleanor stepped away with a small nod, her expression inscrutable. The weeks that followed were filled with carefully orchestrated moments. Jack found ways to be near Eleanor without seeming too eager. He sent her handwritten notes with observations from their conversations and small gifts that were meaningful but modest. He read books on art and history to keep up with her intellect, absorbing stories of bygone eras to weave into their discussions. One evening, Jack was invited to Eleanor's estate for dinner, an event that felt like an audition. The Whitmore mansion was as opulent as its reputation suggested. Marble floors, towering columns, and walls lined with paintings that whispered stories of forgotten masters. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and gold candelabras, was intimidating, but Jack was unfazed. They shared a meal prepared by a chef who spoke French as if it were poetry. Eleanor tested him with questions about politics, literature, and world events, watching him with hawk-like precision. Jack countered each query with charm and intelligence, masking the effort it took to keep pace. As dessert was served, Eleanor placed her fork down and looked at him thoughtfully. "Tell me, Jack, have you always pursued what you wanted with such determination?" "Always," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "When you grow up with little, you learn to reach for what matters. You taught me that, in a way." She raised an eyebrow, a rare show of genuine curiosity. "And how did I do that?" Jack smiled, eyes softening. "By proving that resilience and wit can reshape one's destiny." The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. Eleanor's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, Jack felt that he had crossed an unseen threshold. But even in that moment of perceived victory, he noticed the flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "I admire that," she said at last, raising her glass in a toast. "To resilience, then?" "To resilience," Jack echoed, masking the tremor in his hand. He had made his play, but something told him that Eleanor had just made hers. The brisk winter air carried a touch of finality as the grand doors of St. Edward's Chapel swung open, revealing Jack and Eleanor side by side. The murmurs of guests quickly silenced, replaced by the melodic chime of the church organ. The pews were filled with Greenfield's elite, dressed in their finest attire, their faces a mosaic of disbelief and forced smiles. They had gathered not out of affection for the couple, but out of curiosity, drawn to witness the union that had become the most whispered about scandal in the state. Jack stood tall in a tailored black tuxedo, exuding the calm confidence he had so carefully cultivated. Eleanor, resplendent in a pearl-white gown that contrasted starkly with her age, appeared regal and unyielding, as if daring anyone to question her decision. Her eyes, lined with years of laughter and pain, searched the room with a knowing gaze that seemed to see through the shallow well-wishers. As the vows were exchanged, Jack's pulse quickened. The words, "until death do us part," rolled off his tongue with an ease that surprised even him. He stole a glance at Eleanor. She met his gaze, lips curled in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A chill settled over him, but he dismissed it as a product of his nerves. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, a polite applause rippled through the chapel. Jack bent to kiss Eleanor, his smile wide for the cameras. The flashbulbs exploded in rapid succession, capturing the moment that would be splashed across society pages the next day, dissected by the readers over their morning coffee. The reception at Whitmore Manor was an opulent affair. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in soft light, and violins played a tune that waltzed between the guests like an invisible dancer. Tables were adorned with arrangements of blue hydrangeas, Eleanor's favorite, and guests sipped champagne poured from bottles older than some of the attendees. Jack navigated the room with a practiced ease, shaking hands, accepting congratulations with a smile that hinted at genuine happiness. Yet, beneath the surface, his mind raced. He could almost feel the weight of the Whitmore fortune pressing down on him, a reminder of what he had achieved and what he now had to secure. For Eleanor, the evening seemed almost routine. She floated from group to group, her laughter high and brittle, never lingering too long. "Mr. Montgomery," a voice interrupted his musings. Jack turned to see Ronald Whitmore, Eleanor's distant cousin, and a man with a sharp tongue and sharper suits. Ronald had always been an outspoken skeptic of the match, his disapproval voiced in private circles and in whispers that had found their way back to Jack. "Ronald," Jack greeted smoothly, extending his hand. The older man looked at it for a beat too long before shaking it. "So, here we are," Ronald said, eyes narrowing. "You've finally managed to charm your way into the Whitmore dynasty. I hope you know that she's not as soft as she lets on." Jack's smile tightened imperceptibly. "I'd never underestimate her." "Good," Ronald replied, swirling his drink. "Because she never underestimates anyone." Before Jack could respond, Ronald melted back into the crowd, leaving a trail of unease behind him. Jack's gaze followed him for a moment before shifting to Eleanor, who was watching the exchange from across the room. She raised her glass in a silent toast, her eyes glinting like a predator's. Jack's heart thudded in his chest. What was it that Ronald knew? The days following the wedding were a whirlwind of indulgence. Jack reveled in the luxuries now at his disposal. The fleet of cars in the estate's expansive garage, the weekends spent in New York City attending exclusive gallery openings, and the vacations to Europe, where the Whitmores owned a sprawling villa on the Amalfi Coast. The initial exhilaration was intoxicating, as if he'd been thrust into a dream that was finally real. Eleanor, however, maintained a schedule that surprised him. At dawn, she would be in the conservatory practicing yoga with the precision of a younger woman. By noon, she met with advisors, reviewing investments and ensuring her businesses ran smoothly. Despite her age, she was sharp and fully in control of her empire. Jack watched these routines with mixed feelings. The more he observed, the more he realized that Eleanor was not the frail old woman he had convinced himself she was. Instead, she was vibrant, decisive, and fiercely independent. He found himself drawn to her in moments, when she spoke passionately about art or when she regaled him with stories of her travels in the 60s. But then, just as quickly, he would recall why he was there, and the attraction would turn into a calculated patience. One evening, as they sat by the crackling fireplace in the library, Eleanor handed Jack a glass of whiskey, its amber color catching the firelight. "To our future," she said, eyes boring into him with that unreadable expression. "To us," Jack echoed, taking a sip. Eleanor leaned back, a smile playing on her lips. "Tell me, Jack, do you think you're ready for what comes next?" The question was disarming. He forced a chuckle. "And what would that be?" She traced the rim of her glass with a manicured finger. "Life with me. It's not just dinner parties and trips to Europe. You'll be under a microscope, scrutinized by people who believe they know me. And now you. They'll test you, as will I." The room seemed to shrink. The fire's warmth felt suffocating. "Test me? In what way?" "Oh, you'll find out," she said, draining her glass and standing. "It's late, and tomorrow will be busy." With that, she left the room, her silhouette lingering in the doorway before disappearing into the hall. Jack's fingers tightened around the crystal glass until it threatened to crack. For the first time, he felt the unease settle deep in his bones. It wasn't just the inheritance he would be fighting for. It was his place in a world that might consume him before he ever had the chance to claim it. The following weeks began to reveal the first of those tests. Eleanor's schedule became more demanding, involving Jack in meetings where financial and business acumen were expected. She watched him intently during these sessions, occasionally dropping questions that seemed harmless but were anything but. Her probing left him feeling both challenged and exposed. Rumors began to surface. Vague whispers that Eleanor was planning something big, something that might disrupt everything Jack thought he knew about her in their arrangement. Conversations with the staff grew terse, the air heavy with unspoken words. Jack started to feel as if the very walls of Whitmore Manor were listening, waiting to see if he would falter. The reality of being Eleanor's husband was dawning on him. She was more than a wealthy widow. She was a player in a game he was only beginning to understand, a game where the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Jack lay awake that night, staring at the intricately carved ceiling, feeling the weight of the mansion pressing down on him. He was beginning to realize that Eleanor had never intended to make this easy. She was not a trophy to be won, but a queen who never relinquished her throne without a battle. The winter months bled into spring, and with them came a shift in the atmosphere at Whitmore Manor. The manor itself, with its endless corridors and countless rooms filled with antique relics, seemed to hum with stories. Jack had begun to explore its vast expanse in the early mornings when Eleanor was occupied with her meetings or personal routines. He told himself it was out of curiosity, but the truth ran deeper. He was searching for answers, for leverage, for anything that could illuminate the enigmatic woman who now shared his life. One morning, Jack found himself in the West Wing, a part of the manor seldom visited by anyone but the cleaning staff. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of sunlight that cut through the thick drapes. He pushed open a door that creaked with the weight of years, revealing a room that was more of a small museum. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines bore titles in Latin, French, and languages he couldn't recognize. A large mahogany desk stood in the center, cluttered with papers and framed photographs. Jack's gaze landed on a photograph that seemed out of place among the formal portraits. It was an old, faded snapshot of a young Eleanor, her hair dark and cascading in waves over her shoulders, standing next to a man Jack didn't recognize. They were smiling at each other, eyes locked with an intensity that spoke of deep connection. On the back of the frame, a handwritten note read to E. "Forever in your shadow, R***." A knot tightened in Jack's chest. He had assumed that Richard Whitmore, Eleanor's deceased husband, was her only significant relationship. But this man was different. Young, confident, with a playful grin that was entirely unlike the stoic countenance of Richard. "Ah, you found Robert," a voice said from behind, startling Jack. He spun around to see Margaret, the head housekeeper, standing in the doorway with a folded towel in her arms. Jack forced a smile to mask his surprise. "Robert? I wasn't aware of a Robert." Margaret's expression was unreadable, her eyes flickering with something between caution and nostalgia. "Robert Harrington. They were close before Mr. Whitmore came into the picture. But that's a story Eleanor doesn't share." Before Jack could probe further, Margaret turned on her heel and left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. The silence that followed was deafening. He set the photo back down carefully and began searching the desk. Old letters, some in Eleanor's handwriting and some in a bold, slanted script, confirmed what Margaret had said. Robert had been important to Eleanor, possibly more than Richard ever was. The letters hinted at a relationship full of passion and conflict, with references to clandestine meetings and shared dreams of escaping the suffocating norms of high society. But suddenly, the correspondence stopped, as if one day Robert had simply ceased to exist. The discovery gnawed at Jack throughout the day. At lunch, as Eleanor sat across from him, cutting into her poached salmon with deliberate precision, he couldn't help but study her, searching for traces of the woman in the photograph. She seemed almost ageless in that moment, regal as ever, but he could now see the layers beneath the practiced grace. "Everything all right, Jack?" she asked, not looking up from her plate. "Of course," he replied, taking a sip of his wine to steady himself. Just admiring how you manage everything so effortlessly." She raised her eyes, blue and as sharp as ever, and held his gaze. "Effortlessness is an illusion, darling. It takes years of practice." A beat of silence passed, thick with unspoken meanings. Jack nodded slowly, returning to his meal, but feeling more than ever that Eleanor was playing a game he couldn't quite grasp. Over the following weeks, Jack pieced together more fragments of Eleanor's past. He approached the older staff with casual questions and listened closely to the whispers that occasionally slipped through their professional demeanor. He learned that Robert Harrington had been an artist, a painter who moved through New York's bohemian circles in the late 1960s. His brief relationship with Eleanor had been a scandal among Greenfield's elites. But just as quickly as it began, it ended under mysterious circumstances. Some said he left for Europe to pursue a muse. Others hinted at a more sinister ending. Jack's instincts told him that Eleanor had been involved in whatever had happened, but the pieces didn't quite fit. Why was she still so powerful if she harbored such a scandalous secret? One evening, Eleanor invited Jack to join her for a private dinner in the conservatory. The glass walls reflected the last of the day's light as the sky blushed deep purple. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and roses. Eleanor wore a deep emerald dress that caught the green hues of her eyes, making them almost hypnotic. "Do you know why I married Richard?" she asked suddenly, swirling the wine in her glass. The question was unexpected, a trap wrapped in velvet. Jack hesitated, unsure whether honesty or flattery would serve him better. "I'd imagine it was for love." Eleanor laughed, the sound as rich as the wine she sipped. "Love is a luxury, Jack. No, I married Richard because he understood power, and I needed someone who could give me the life I wanted." Jack studied her, looking for any cracks in her facade. "And Robert? What did he give you?" The laughter died, and a shadow passed over her face. Eleanor's eyes darkened as she set her glass down with deliberate care. "You've been digging," she said, her voice flat but with an edge that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand. "I came across an old photograph," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "It made me wonder about your life before all of this." Eleanor's silence stretched until it became suffocating. She stood, her movements fluid and controlled, and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening gardens. "Robert was a part of my life that I buried for a reason," she said finally, her voice low and distant. "He taught me what it meant to risk everything for something intangible, something that couldn't be measured in stocks or estates." Jack's curiosity flared, but he sensed that pressing further would be dangerous. "Why did it end?" Eleanor turned, and in the dim light, she looked almost spectral. "Because he made a mistake. And in our world, mistakes are fatal." She walked past him, her perfume lingering in the air long after she was gone, leaving Jack alone with more questions than answers. He felt the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. Eleanor's world was far more perilous than he had ever imagined, and whatever secret she kept about Robert's fate, they were enough to make him wonder if he would one day share a similar ending. That night, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling's ornate patterns. The image of Robert's photograph haunted him, a reminder that Eleanor's past was a labyrinth filled with shadows. He realized that understanding her fully would mean risking more than his heart or pride. It would mean placing himself in the path of dangers he couldn't yet comprehend. But if he wanted to outmaneuver her, he needed to know every secret she held, no matter how dark. Little did he know, Eleanor was also lying awake in her room, eyes open, lost in memories of a man who once promised her the world, and the cost she paid for turning her back on it. Jack awoke to a sharp knock at his door, the kind that conveyed urgency. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of his suite, painting golden lines across the parquet floor. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he pulled on a robe and opened the door to find Margaret, the ever-efficient housekeeper, standing with her arms crossed and eyes that spoke of 1,000 secrets. "Mrs. Whitmore requests your presence in the study." "Immediately," she said, her tone clipped. Jack's pulse quickened. Eleanor's summons were never casual. He nodded, dressing quickly in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks before making his way down the hall. The manor was alive with a tense energy, the usual hum of the staff replaced by whispers and hurried movements. Something had shifted. The study door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open to find Eleanor standing by the fireplace, her emerald silk robe draping elegantly over her frame. The glow from the fire cast shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp planes of her cheekbones. On the large oak desk, papers were strewn carelessly, a stark contrast to her usual order. "Jack," she said without turning, her voice steady but low. "Do you know what it means to be tested?" The question hung in the air, charged with unspoken challenges. Jack cleared his throat. "I imagine it's what you've been doing since the day we met." She smiled faintly, eyes locked on the flames. "Clever. But today we escalate?" Before he could ask what she meant, Eleanor faced him, her eyes holding a spark he hadn't seen before. She moved to the desk and picked up an envelope sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Whitmore crest. She handed it to him with an air of finality. "Read it." Jack broke the seal, his fingers stiff with anticipation. Inside was a single sheet of paper with elegant script. "Asterisk, you are invited to participate in a challenge. One that will prove your worth not just to Eleanor, but to the legacy she guards. Succeed, and you will understand what it means to be a Whitmore. Fail, and you will be left with nothing but regret, asterisk." Beneath the script was a date and time. Tomorrow evening, 8 p.m., and a location. The Whitmore Lodge, a property he had heard of but never visited. He looked up to see Eleanor watching him, her expression unreadable. "Is this a game to you?" he asked, feeling both excitement and dread coil in his gut. "It's survival," she corrected. "In this world, loyalty, intelligence, and resilience are more valuable than gold. I need to know where you stand." Jack's mind raced. He wanted to question her, to push back against the absurdity of being tested like some errant schoolboy, but something in her gaze stilled him. He nodded, tucking the envelope into his pocket. "Then I'll be there." The day passed in a blur of restless anticipation. Jack spent hours in the library, reading over old documents and trying to glean anything that might prepare him for what was to come. The Whitmore Lodge was a hunting estate, smaller than the main manor, but steeped in as much history and rumor. Stories of secret deals brokered and alliances tested filled the annals of its past. The sun had set by the time Jack approached the lodge, its silhouette looming against a sky bruised purple with twilight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the gravel crunching underfoot as he walked to the large double doors. They opened without a sound, revealing an interior that was both lavish and foreboding. A roaring fire dominated one wall, its light casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Eleanor stood near a round table set with an old map, a decanter of amber liquid, and an assortment of papers. She wasn't alone. Beside her, Ronald Whitmore leaned against the mantel, a smirk playing on his lips. His presence was both unwelcome and unsurprising. Others, familiar faces from Greenfield's elite, formed a semicircle behind them, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. "So, the boy finally arrives," Ronald drawled, lifting his glass in a mock salute. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." "Hardly," Jack replied, forcing a smile. Eleanor raised a hand, silencing the room. "Tonight marks the first trial," she said, her voice commanding attention. "Each participant in this room has, at one point, proven themselves worthy of the Whitmore name. Now, Jack must do the same." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jack stood straighter, determined not to show any hesitation. Eleanor's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he saw something almost like pride. But it was fleeting. "Your task is simple," she continued. "This map marks a path through the woods surrounding the lodge. At the end lies a hidden token. Retrieve it before dawn, and you pass. Fail, and..." She let the silence speak for itself. Jack's jaw tightened. The woods were notorious, spoken of in childhood tales as a place where the line between reality and legend blurred. But he nodded, refusing to be the first to break. The night air was sharp and cold as Jack stepped outside, the heavy silence of the woods enveloping him. The map in his hand felt flimsy, inadequate against the vast darkness ahead. He took a deep breath and started down the marked path, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots echoing with each step. The woods closed in around him, the towering pines casting twisted, skeletal shadows. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, forcing him to rely on the flashlight he carried. Minutes turned to an hour, the path winding deeper into the forest. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of unseen movement sent a jolt through him, but he pressed on. Halfway through, a sound caught his attention, a low growl, deep and guttural. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he swung the flashlight around, catching the reflective eyes of a wolf watching him from the underbrush. It was alone, but its gaze was steady, unyielding. He took a careful step back, his mind racing with how to handle the encounter. The wolf didn't advance, but let out another growl before slinking away, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Jack exhaled shakily, the realization of how close he'd come to disaster rattling him. But there was no time to dwell. He pressed on, the cold seeping through his clothes and gnawing at his resolve. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found the clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone pedestal, weathered and cracked. On it lay a small metal object shaped like an eagle, the Whitmore crest. Relief washed over him as he grabbed the token, the chill of the metal biting into his palm. A sudden rustle behind him made him whirl around, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Eleanor stood there, watching him, an unreadable expression on her face. "You're early," she said softly, stepping into the light. "You're here?" Jack's voice was a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. "I needed to see if you'd hesitate," Eleanor replied, her eyes never leaving his. "If you'd turn back when faced with fear. But you didn't." The corners of her mouth lifted slightly, a smile that felt more like the promise of more tests to come. She stepped forward and reached out, touching the token in his hand before leaning in close. "Welcome to the real game, Jack," she whispered. As she turned and walked back into the woods, the weight of what lay ahead settled over him. This trial had been just the beginning, a taste of the true challenges that Eleanor had in store. And in that moment, Jack realized he was no longer just fighting for wealth or status. He was fighting for his place in a world where Eleanor was both queen and architect. The following day at Whitmore Manor was marked by an air of silent tension. The staff moved briskly, eyes cast down as they went about their tasks. Jack's successful retrieval of the token from the woods had not gone unnoticed. Whispers flitted from room to room like unseen messengers, spreading rumors of what the trial meant and what might come next. Jack sat in the study, staring at the small eagle token that rested on the desk. It felt heavier than before, as if imbued with the weight of expectations and dangers he was only beginning to comprehend. He turned it over in his hands, the cold metal biting into his skin, when a knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret, with her impeccable posture and stoic face, entered carrying a letter on a silver tray. "This just arrived for you, Mr. Montgomery," she said, placing the envelope in front of him before withdrawing silently. The envelope was unmarked save for his name, written in an unfamiliar hand. He tore it open, unfolding a single sheet of parchment. "Asterisk, you've passed the first test, but the true challenge is one of loyalty and deception. Be ready to prove your allegiance, or your secrets will become your undoing." Asterisk. A chill ran down his spine. The letter offered no signature, no clue as to its sender. He stood, pushing his chair back, and paced the length of the study. Who was playing this game? Was it Eleanor herself, or someone with a vested interest in testing his resolve? That evening, Eleanor called for a gathering in the ballroom. The grand room was set with long tables covered in velvet cloths, candelabras casting flickering light across the gilded walls. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as members of Greenfield's upper echelon arrived, their conversations punctuated by knowing glances and laughter that carried a sharp edge. Eleanor, dressed in a deep burgundy gown that exuded power, stood at the head of the room. Beside her, Ronald sipped his drink, his eyes darting to Jack with a smirk that suggested he knew something Jack did not. The guests settled, and Eleanor raised her glass, a smile playing on her lips. "Tonight, we celebrate resilience," she began, her voice commanding immediate attention. "But as we raise our glasses, let us remember that survival isn't won with brute strength, but with cunning and loyalty." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on Jack. "And sometimes, loyalty must be proven." The crowd turned as one to Jack, who felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes bearing down on him. Eleanor gestured to him, the invitation clear. "Jack, would you care to join me here?" she asked, the question more a command than a request. He stood, maintaining an air of calm as he walked to the front. The guests shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as if to better catch whatever would unfold next. "I've prepared a little exercise," Eleanor continued, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Ronald has graciously volunteered to help." Ronald's smirk widened as he stepped up beside her, his presence radiating a challenge. Jack's pulse quickened, but he nodded, refusing to let doubt show. "I'm ready." Eleanor clapped her hands, and two staff members brought forward a large, black box with a hinged lid. She lifted it, revealing an intricate board with a layout that resembled a chess game, but with pieces Jack had never seen before. Knights holding swords, bishops carved as hooded figures, and kings with sharp crowns that seemed almost menacing. "This is no ordinary game," Eleanor said, moving a piece forward on the board. "Each move you make will reveal truths and lies. Your objective is to reach the center without sacrificing your allies or being cornered by betrayal." Ronald placed a piece of his own, his eyes narrowing with anticipation. "But be careful, Jack. Every move has consequences." The game began, and the room watched with rapt attention as Jack and Ronald moved their pieces in turn. Each move revealed a hidden card beneath, inscribed with cryptic messages. Jack's first move turned up a card that read, "The friend is not always what they seem, *" Ronald's produced, "The past is never silent, *" As they continued, the tension thickened. Jack's mind raced as he pieced together the implications of each move. The game was more than a test of strategy. It was an exposure of secrets. The whispered stories he'd gathered about Eleanor, the unresolved mystery of Robert Harrington, and even the recent anonymous note all coalesced in his thoughts. Ronald pushed his piece forward, smirking as a new card was revealed. "Only those willing to betray can truly be trusted, *" A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, the statement sending shivers down Jack's spine. He looked up to find Eleanor watching him, her eyes inscrutable. Jack's fingers hovered over his piece. He knew that a reckless move could tip his hand, but hesitation was also a risk. He chose carefully, shifting his knight 2 spaces and flipping the card, "Truth will outlive a lie, but not without a price, *" Ronald's smile faltered slightly. The crowd noticed, the hum of their reactions a low thrum in the room. Jack's chest tightened as he met Ronald's gaze, seeing something shift in the man's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. Eleanor broke the silence with a slow clap. "Well played, Jack," she said, her voice warm but tinged with something more. "The round is yours, but the night is not over." Ronald's jaw tightened, his smirk fading entirely. The game was called, but the tension remained, the unspoken promise of further trials hanging in the air. The guests dispersed into smaller conversations, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. He took a drink from a passing waiter and retreated to a corner where he could gather his thoughts. Ronald approached him moments later, his expression dark. "You think you've won something tonight, don't you?" he said, his voice low enough that only Jack could hear. "I think I held my own," Jack replied evenly. Ronald leaned in, his eyes cold. "This isn't a game for you to win. It's a game for Eleanor to play. And when she's done, you'll wish you never stepped foot in this house." Before Jack could respond, Ronald walked away, leaving him with a simmering sense of foreboding. The night's events replayed in his mind, each move, each cryptic message fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that was still incomplete. As the crowd thinned and the night wound down, Eleanor caught his eye from across the room. She inclined her head, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. He nodded back, the understanding clear. Tonight had only been the beginning. The real game, the one where loyalty and betrayal blurred, was about to truly begin. Jack left the ballroom, the weight of the eagle token in his pocket serving as a silent reminder of the path he had chosen. And for the first time, he wondered if it was not Eleanor who was at the heart of the game, but the ghost of a past that refused to be silenced. The night air outside Whitmore Manor was cold, the crisp silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. The manor's silhouette loomed behind Jack, its lights casting long, golden fingers onto the manicured lawns. He had left the ballroom hours ago, unable to shake the feeling that the night's events were part of something larger. The cryptic game with Ronald, Eleanor's veiled threats disguised as compliments. It all seemed to be converging on a point he couldn't yet see. Back in his suite, Jack paced the floor. The eagle token sat on his nightstand, glinting in the moonlight. He picked it up, its metallic chill grounding him, when a soft knock came at the door. "Come in," he called, half expecting Margaret or one of the staff. Instead, Eleanor entered, her eyes shadowed but sharp. She was still in her burgundy gown, but her posture had shifted, less composed, more weary. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. For the first time, Jack saw the weight of age on her, the way her shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible burden. "About what?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with the edge of exhaustion. "About Robert," she said, her gaze piercing him. "And about what this has all been leading to." Jack's breath caught. He'd spent weeks piecing together the mystery of Robert Harrington, only to be met with dead ends and half-truths. Now, the truth was walking into his room, cloaked in silk and secrecy. "Tell me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out into the dark expanse of the gardens. "Robert wasn't just a lover," she began. "He was my partner in a plan that, at the time, seemed like a way out. We wanted to leverage the Whitmore fortune for more than social power. We wanted change, control over our own destiny." She turned back to him, her eyes glistening with something raw. "But Robert had ambitions that eclipsed even mine. He became reckless, too daring. He tried to strike a deal with someone who saw him as a threat." "Who?" Jack pressed, leaning forward. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling. "My late husband. He was more ruthless than anyone ever knew. When he discovered Robert's intentions, he set a trap. Robert disappeared, and it was said he left for Europe, but he never did. Richard made sure of that." The room seemed to close in on Jack. The whispers of Greenfield society, the hints of scandal. This was the dark heart of it all. "And you let everyone believe the lie," he said, more an accusation than a question. Eleanor nodded, the fire in her eyes now tempered by grief. "It was the only way to survive. Richard made it clear that if I wanted to keep my position, if I wanted power, I had to play by his rules." Jack felt the pieces fall into place, the picture forming one of betrayal, ambition, and the cost of power. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Because you remind me of him," Eleanor admitted, crossing the room to face him. "The same ambition, the same hunger. But there's a choice to be made now, one that echoes the past. I need to know where you stand, Jack." He stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a vice. The trials, the games, the cryptic notes, they were all leading to this. Eleanor needed someone who would be loyal, not just to her, but to the legacy she was protecting. Or she needed someone who would fall, just as Robert had. "And if I refused to play," he asked, searching her eyes for any hint of mercy. "Then you leave tonight," she said, her voice void of emotion. "With nothing?" Jack felt the pulse of anger rise in him, hot and bright. "You tested me, pushed me to prove my loyalty, all because you were trying to rewrite history? Because you wanted to see if I would betray you like Robert did?" Eleanor's gaze softened, a hint of vulnerability cracking her cold exterior. "Yes, but it's more than that. This time, the choice is yours, not mine." The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Jack's mind raced. He could leave, take whatever shreds of dignity remained, and start anew. But starting over meant walking away from everything he'd fought for. The power, the influence, and Eleanor herself, who despite everything, had captivated him in ways he didn't understand. "No," he said finally. I'm not leaving. I'm staying, but not to play your game. I'm staying because I won't be another pawn in this legacy. If we're to continue, it's as equals. A flicker of surprise crossed Eleanor's face before it settled into a smile. A real one. This time, touched with relief and something more profound. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his cheek. Then let's end this charade, she whispered, and start anew. The days that followed were marked by a shift in power dynamics. Jack was no longer just Eleanor's husband or a convenient heir in training. He was her partner, privy to the secrets that had built the Whitmore empire and the alliances that had kept it standing. They worked side by side, Eleanor's sharp mind complementing Jack's strategic brilliance. But with power came new enemies. Ronald, sensing his waning influence, grew more desperate, more reckless. He challenged Jack openly during meetings, spreading rumors that hinted at betrayal. But Jack, with Eleanor's backing, navigated each attack with a deftness that left Ronald seething. One evening, after a particularly contentious board meeting, Ronald confronted Jack in the corridor. "You think you've won, don't you?" he hissed. "But you're just another piece on our board. Just like Robert." Jack's eyes hardened. "No, Ronald. I'm the one writing the next chapter." The older man's face twisted in anger. But before he could respond, Eleanor appeared at Jack's side. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone cool. Ronald's mouth opened and closed, but he said nothing, turning on his heel and storming away. Eleanor watched him go, then turned to Jack, a shadow of concern clouding her expression. "We have to be careful," she said softly. "We will be," Jack promised, slipping his hand into hers. Weeks turned to months, and the alliance between Jack and Eleanor deepened. The mansion's halls that once whispered with the echoes of past secrets now buzzed with the activity of new ventures and revitalized power. Jack no longer felt like an outsider. He was at the center, standing with Eleanor, not as an heir vying for inheritance, but as a true partner shaping the future. And yet, late at night, when the world was quiet, the echoes of Robert's fate haunted him. They were a reminder of the razor-thin line he walked, where trust was as valuable as gold and betrayal as lethal as a blade. But for now, with Eleanor beside him and the future theirs to command, he felt ready for whatever came next. The final game, it seemed, had only just begun.